The morning frost clung to the steel hull of the Sherman tank like a death shroud, as Sergeant Cornelius Ravencroft pressed his eye to the periscope, scanning the tree line ahead. December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. His hands trembled, not from the bitter cold seeping through the armor plating, but from the weight of the decision forming in his mind. Through the scope, he could see the telltale glint of German steel positioned in the shadows between the pines, barrels aimed directly at his advancing column. Standard protocol demanded he radio the contact and wait for orders, but 17 American tanks were rolling straight into what every instinct in his body screamed was a perfectly orchestrated trap. The radio crackled with static, then silence. His commander's voice had been cut off mid-sentence 3 minutes ago. Ravencroft's finger hovered over the transmission button, then moved to the gear lever instead. What he was about to do violated every rule in the tank commander's manual. It defied direct orders to maintain formation and advance on the designated route. But as he watched the lead Sherman roll closer to certain destruction, one thought crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. Sometimes survival demanded disobedience. He slammed the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator. No one in the 3rd Armored Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history and prove that the most devastating weapon against overwhelming odds was a single tank driver willing to break every rule to save his brothers. Cornelius Ravencroft had never intended to become a tank commander. Born in the rugged hills of Montana in 1922, he was the son of a railroad engineer and a schoolteacher who valued hard work above all else. His childhood was spent learning to fix machinery with his father, developing an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that would serve him well in the steel beasts of war. When he enlisted in the army in 1942, his plan was simple: serve his country, do his duty, and return home to marry his childhood sweetheart and take over his uncle's auto repair shop. The recruiting sergeant took one look at his mechanical aptitude scores and sent him to the newly formed armored divisions, where he learned to operate, maintain, and command the M4 Sherman tank. His fellow soldiers initially viewed him with skepticism. Ravencroft was quiet, methodical, and had a tendency to question orders when they seemed tactically unsound. This did not endear him to drill sergeants who valued unquestioning obedience above all else. During training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, he repeatedly found himself in disciplinary hearings for suggesting alternative approaches to standard maneuvers. His instructors noted in his file that while his mechanical skills were exceptional and his tactical instincts sharp, he possessed an unfortunate tendency toward independent thinking that could prove problematic in combat situations. But his crew began to see something different. When their tank broke down during a training exercise in the Kentucky mud, Ravencroft spent 18 straight hours in the rain, working by flashlight to repair a transmission that the manual declared irreparable in field conditions. When they emerged from that exercise with the only fully operational tank in their company, his crew's skepticism transformed into absolute loyalty. They began to understand that their quiet commander possessed something rare: the ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. He had no idea that soon, those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The winter of 1944 found the Western Front locked in a deadly stalemate that would explode into one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. Adolf Hitler, facing certain defeat on both the Eastern and Western fronts, had gambled everything on a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest, the same route German forces had used to devastating effect in 1940. Operation Watch on the Rhine, later known to Allied forces as the Battle of the Bulge, was designed to split Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all forces against the advancing Soviet Union. The mathematics of the situation was starkly simple. 24 German divisions, including elite Waffen-SS units and the feared 6th Panzer Army, were massing for an assault against what intelligence estimated were only 4 American divisions spread across an 80-mile front. The American forces in the Ardennes were largely inexperienced troops sent to this quiet sector to gain battlefield experience or battle-weary veterans sent to recover from previous campaigns. They were equipped with the reliable but outgunned M4 Sherman tanks that, while mechanically dependable and easy to maintain, were no match for the heavily armored German Panthers and Tigers in direct confrontation. German intelligence had calculated that surprise, superior armor, and overwhelming local superiority would allow them to break through American lines within 48 hours and reach the Meuse River before Allied reserves could respond. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the assumption that American forces would follow standard defensive doctrines when faced with overwhelming odds. What the German planners failed to account for was the capacity of individual American soldiers to improvise, adapt, and fight with desperate innovation when faced with impossible circumstances. They had studied American tactical manuals and prepared for conventional responses to their assault, but they had not prepared for the chaos that ensued when those manuals were thrown aside in favor of pure survival instinct. The pre-dawn hours of December 16th brought with them an artillery barrage that shattered the winter silence and announced the beginning of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Ravencroft's tank, designated Charlie 7, was part of Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division, positioned near the village of Krinkelt, in what had been considered a quiet sector of the American line. The initial German assault swept through American positions with terrifying efficiency, overrunning entire companies and creating pockets of isolated resistance throughout the forest. Communication systems failed under the intensity of the bombardment, leaving individual units cut off from higher command and forced to make critical decisions with incomplete information about the scope and direction of the German advance. By the morning of December 17th, Ravencroft's company had been ordered to conduct a reconnaissance in force toward the village of Bullingen, where German forces were reported to be massing for a further advance toward the strategic road junction at Malmedy. The mission briefing had been brief and optimistic. Proceed along the designated route, make contact with the enemy, determine their strength and disposition, and report back to division headquarters for further instructions. Intelligence estimates suggested they would encounter light resistance from scattered German units retreating from their initial assault positions. The reality they discovered was far different and infinitely more dangerous. As Charlie 7 and 16 other Sherman tanks moved through the morning mist along the forest road, Ravencroft noticed details that made his trained instinct scream warnings his superiors had failed to recognize. The absence of German dead along routes that should have been contested, fresh tank tracks in the mud that seemed too deep and too wide for the light armor they were supposedly pursuing, the unnatural silence from a forest that should have been alive with the sounds of retreat and reorganization. Most troubling of all, the complete absence of German equipment abandoned during what intelligence insisted was a hasty withdrawal. He had served long enough to recognize the signs of a deliberate deception, but protocol demanded that he maintain radio silence except in case of direct enemy contact. The standing orders were clear: advance along the designated route, maintain formation integrity, and engage only when engaged. What those orders failed to account for was the possibility that the entire mission was based on fatally flawed intelligence, and that 17 American tanks were advancing directly into a carefully prepared killing ground. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. The German ambush position had been prepared with methodical precision that reflected months of planning and intimate knowledge of American tactical doctrine. 3 companies of Panzer IVs and Panthers, approximately 36 tanks in total, had been positioned in carefully camouflaged positions along both sides of the forest road, with additional anti-tank guns in place to block any attempt at retreat. The killing ground had been selected to maximize the effectiveness of German firepower, while minimizing the ability of American forces to maneuver or coordinate their response. The road curved gently through a valley between 2 low ridges, creating a natural funnel that would compress the American formation and prevent individual tanks from seeking cover or supporting each other effectively. German commanders had studied captured American tactical manuals and knew that standard doctrine called for American forces to advance in column formation along roads, with intervals between vehicles designed to minimize casualties from artillery fire, but which also prevented mutual support when faced with ambush. The plan was textbook in its simplicity. Allow the American column to advance deep into the killing ground, then open fire simultaneously from concealed positions, destroying the lead and rear vehicles to trap the remainder in a crossfire that would eliminate the entire force within minutes. What made the trap particularly deadly was its psychological component. American tank crews, finding themselves under fire from multiple directions with no clear avenue of retreat, would likely panic and make the tactical errors that would ensure their complete destruction. German crews had been instructed to target command tanks first, disrupting American coordination and leadership, then systematically destroy remaining vehicles in order of their threat level. The mathematics were brutally simple. 36 German tanks firing from prepared positions against 17 American tanks caught in the open would result in complete annihilation of the American force within 5 to 10 minutes. Intelligence estimates suggested that such a decisive victory would create a gap in American lines that could be exploited for a breakthrough toward critical supply routes and communication centers. The plan accounted for every aspect of American doctrine and training, but it failed to consider the possibility that one American tank commander might recognize the trap and choose to act outside the parameters of conventional tactics. And then, silence, until the next order came through. Ravencroft's recognition of the ambush came in pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself in his mind as his tank rolled deeper into the valley. The first clue was the condition of the road itself, too smooth, too clear of the debris that should have littered the route of a retreating enemy. The second was the pattern of shadows in the tree line, too regular and too geometric to be natural forest growth. But the moment of absolute certainty came when sunlight glinted off a lens in the woods to his right, the unmistakable reflection of an optical sight trained on his column. In that instant, every piece of tactical training crystallized into a single, horrifying understanding. His entire company was advancing into a perfectly prepared killing ground, and standard doctrine would get every one of them killed. The radio remained silent, his requests for guidance met with static that suggested communication had been jammed or severed. His fellow tank commanders continued their advance, following orders with the discipline that had been drilled into them through months of training, unaware that their adherence to protocol was leading them toward certain death. Ravencroft faced a choice that would define not only his own survival, but the fate of 16 other crews who had placed their trust in military hierarchy and standard operating procedures. He could follow orders, maintain formation, and advance into an ambush that would likely kill every American in the valley within minutes. Or he could violate direct orders, break formation, and attempt a maneuver so unorthodox that it existed nowhere in official tactical doctrine, but which might, if executed correctly, disrupt the German plan enough to save lives. The weight of command had never felt heavier than in that moment, when doing his duty meant watching his brothers die, and saving them required an act of disobedience that could result in a court-martial if he survived long enough to face one. His hands moved to the controls with decisive certainty, muscle memory taking over as conscious thought gave way to pure tactical instinct. What he was about to attempt had never been tried in combat, violated every principle of armored warfare he had been taught, and would either save 17 American tank crews or ensure their deaths came with his name attached to the failure. The maneuver that Ravencroft executed in the next 14 seconds would later be studied in military academies as an example of tactical innovation under extreme pressure. But in the moment, it felt like controlled desperation channeled through steel and determination. Instead of continuing forward into the German crossfire or attempting to reverse along the road where his tank would present a perfect target, Ravencroft did something that defied every rule of armored combat. He threw his Sherman into full reverse, while simultaneously executing a sharp turn that brought his tank's frontal armor to bear on the strongest German position while moving at maximum speed away from the killing ground. The maneuver required split-second timing and perfect coordination between driver, gunner, and loader, all of whom had to trust their commander's instincts, even when his orders seemed to guarantee their destruction. As Charlie 7's engine roared and tracks bit into the forest floor, Ravencroft's gunner, Corporal Stanisław Kowalski, acquired the first German tank and fired a shot that struck the enemy vehicle's turret ring, causing it to burst into flames and illuminating other German positions that had been hidden in shadow. The burning Panzer served as a beacon that revealed the full scope of the ambush to the other American tanks, whose commanders suddenly understood why their lead tank had broken formation and begun what appeared to be a suicidal charge toward superior enemy forces. But Ravencroft's reverse maneuver had achieved something no German planner had anticipated. It had turned the ambush into a meeting engagement where American mobility and adaptability could compete with German firepower and position. Private Jensen, commanding the tank directly behind Charlie 7, froze for a moment as he watched what appeared to be his company commander's complete break with military discipline and tactical doctrine. Then understanding dawned, and he followed Ravencroft's lead, ordering his own tank into a similar reverse maneuver while engaging German positions with high-explosive shells that had been intended for infantry support, but which proved devastatingly effective against camouflaged enemy positions. The chain reaction that followed demonstrated how individual initiative could cascade through military units when conventional doctrine proved inadequate to battlefield realities. One by one, the American tank commanders recognized that survival depended not on following orders, but on adapting to circumstances that no training manual had anticipated. The 14 seconds that followed Ravencroft's initial maneuver transformed a carefully planned German ambush into a chaotic tank battle that bore no resemblance to the textbook engagement either side had expected. German commanders, trained to expect American forces to react to ambush with predictable defensive measures, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow established patterns of behavior. Instead of seeking cover or attempting to withdraw along predetermined routes, American tanks were charging directly toward German positions while firing at maximum rate and maneuvering in ways that made accurate return fire nearly impossible. Ravencroft's Charlie 7, still moving in reverse at dangerous speed, had become the focal point of German defensive fire, drawing shots that would otherwise have been directed at more vulnerable American tanks. His frontal armor, designed to withstand direct hits from German anti-tank guns, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any American tank presenting its side or rear armor to enemy fire. Meanwhile, his gunner continued to engage German positions with accuracy that seemed impossible, given the speed and violence of their maneuver, scoring hits that knocked out 3 German tanks in rapid succession and created gaps in the enemy line that other American tanks could exploit. The psychological effect of Ravencroft's maneuver proved as important as its tactical impact. German tank commanders, expecting to face demoralized and confused American crews trapped in a killing ground, instead found themselves engaged with an enemy that had somehow seized the initiative despite being outnumbered and caught in ambush. The mathematical certainty of German victory began to dissolve as American tanks, freed from the constraints of formation fighting and standard doctrine, began to demonstrate the individual initiative and mechanical reliability that would characterize American armored forces throughout the war. What had been planned as a 5-minute annihilation of trapped American forces transformed into a running gun battle that would last 43 minutes and result in casualties the German planners had never considered possible. Tank crews on both sides began to realize they were participating in an engagement that would be studied and remembered long after the war ended, though none could have predicted that the critical moment had been one American tank commander's decision to break formation and charge backward into hell. The immediate results of Ravencroft's reverse charge became apparent within minutes as the carefully orchestrated German ambush devolved into the kind of close-range tank combat that favored American crews trained in rapid target acquisition and mechanical improvisation. Charlie 7's maneuver had achieved tactical surprise against an enemy that had believed surprise belonged entirely to them, creating confusion in German ranks that prevented the coordinated fire that would have been necessary to destroy the American column. German tank commanders, expecting to engage stationary or slowly retreating targets, found themselves trying to track and hit fast-moving vehicles that presented difficult angles and unpredictable movement patterns. Ravencroft's driver, Private First Class Giovanni Toretti, had responded to orders with skill that bordered on artistry, maintaining control of 38 tons of moving steel while navigating terrain that had never been intended for high-speed armored maneuvers. The tank's engine, pushed beyond normal operating parameters, performed flawlessly despite conditions that should have caused mechanical failure. A testament to both American manufacturing quality and Turretti's mechanical expertise. Kowalski, the gunner, demonstrated why American tank crews were considered among the best trained in the world, maintaining accurate fire while his platform bucked and swayed through maneuvers that made conventional gunnery nearly impossible. His shot placement, guided by instincts developed through hundreds of hours of training, continued to find weak points in German armor, despite conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. The loader, Corporal Marcus Redfeather, fed ammunition into the gun with mechanical precision while braced against a hull that vibrated, with the violence of combat and high-speed maneuvering. Together, the crew of Charlie 7 had become more than the sum of their individual skills, transforming Ravencroft's tactical gamble into a coordinated assault that was wreaking havoc on German defensive positions. But the true measure of their success became apparent when the other American tanks, inspired by their example, began to execute similar maneuvers that amplified the effectiveness of Ravencroft's initial innovation. What one tank had begun, 17 tanks would finish, turning tactical disobedience into strategic victory. The cascade effect of Ravencroft's decision rippled through the American formation, as tank commanders who had been trained to follow orders found themselves improvising solutions to problems that existed nowhere in official doctrine. Lieutenant Bartholomew Ashworth, commanding the second tank in formation, had watched Charlie 7's maneuver with initial disbelief that quickly transformed into tactical understanding, as he recognized how reverse movement could be used to maintain frontal armor protection while creating unexpected angles of attack. His own tank, Devil Dog, executed a modified version of Ravencroft's maneuver, using high-speed reverse to position his gun for flanking shots against German positions that had been designed to defend against frontal assault. The maneuver worked perfectly, allowing Ashworth's gunner to destroy 2 German tanks before enemy crews could adjust their positions to account for this unexpected direction of attack. Sergeant Montgomery Whitehorse, commanding the 3rd American tank, took the tactical innovation even further, using reverse movement to reach a position where his tank could provide covering fire for the advancing American formation while remaining mobile enough to avoid concentrated German return fire. His crew, initially confused by orders that seemed to contradict everything they had learned about armored tactics, quickly adapted to the demands of combat that bore no resemblance to training exercises. The 4th American tank, commanded by Lieutenant Cornelius Blackwater, used the confusion created by the first 3 tanks to execute a flanking maneuver that brought his gun to bear on German positions from an angle that enemy crews had not anticipated or prepared to defend against. Each successive American tank built upon the innovations of those preceding them, creating a pattern of tactical adaptation that transformed individual initiative into collective effectiveness. The German ambush position, designed to counter conventional American tactics, proved inadequate against an enemy that had abandoned convention in favor of desperate innovation, guided by the simple principle that survival required adaptation. Tank crews that had been trained to fight according to established doctrine discovered that real combat demanded the ability to improvise, adapt, and overcome, using whatever methods proved effective. Regardless of whether those methods appeared in official manuals, the mathematics of the engagement had shifted from certain German victory to uncertain outcome, and momentum was beginning to favor the Americans, who had seized the tactical initiative through sheer audacity and mechanical skill. As the battle entered its critical phase, German commanders began to recognize that their carefully planned ambush had been transformed into exactly the kind of fluid tank engagement that favored American training and equipment. The Panzer crews, excellent in defensive operations where they could use superior armor and firepower from prepared positions, found themselves at a disadvantage in the kind of mobile combat where American mechanical reliability and crew training proved decisive. German tank commanders, trained in tactical doctrine that emphasized coordinated fire and position warfare, struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to present predictable targets or follow anticipated patterns of movement. The Panthers and Panzer IVs that had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire found their carefully planned positions compromised by American tanks that were attacking from unexpected directions and angles that German defensive planning had not anticipated. Ravencroft's Charlie 7 continued to serve as the focal point of American offensive action, drawing German fire while creating opportunities for other American tanks to advance and engage from superior positions. The German commander, Major Wilhelm von Seckendorf, attempted to restore tactical coherence to his forces by ordering a general advance that would close with American tanks and negate their mobility advantage. But his orders were delayed by communication difficulties and the chaos of combat that had exceeded all planning parameters. Several German tanks that attempted to advance from their prepared positions found themselves exposed to accurate American fire from multiple directions, demonstrating how Ravencroft's initial maneuver had created tactical opportunities that multiplied exponentially as other American commanders recognized and exploited them. The battle had become a test of training, equipment, and individual initiative rather than the execution of predetermined tactical plans. And in such a test, American advantages in crew training and mechanical reliability began to tell decisively. German casualties mounted steadily as American gunners, freed from the constraints of defensive combat, demonstrated the accuracy and rate of fire that made Sherman tanks effective despite their limitations in armor protection. The tide of battle was turning, but the outcome remained uncertain as both sides committed their reserves and the engagement escalated beyond anything either side had initially envisioned. The climactic moment of the engagement came when German forces, recognizing that their ambush had failed, committed their reserve of 6 Tiger tanks in a desperate attempt to restore tactical advantage through sheer firepower superiority. The Tigers, each mounting an 88mm gun capable of destroying any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, represented the kind of overwhelming technological advantage that should have decided the engagement in Germany's favor. But Ravencroft, observing German movement through his periscope while continuing his reverse maneuver, recognized the opportunity that German desperation had created. The Tigers, advancing from concealed positions to engage American tanks, were temporarily exposed and vulnerable to coordinated attack from multiple directions. In a moment that would later be cited in tactical studies as an example of battlefield innovation under extreme pressure, Ravencroft transmitted the first radio message of the engagement, coordinating American tank movement in a way that concentrated firepower against the advancing Tigers while maintaining the mobility that had proven decisive in the earlier phase of combat. His message was brief and direct. All Charlie units converge on my position and engage the big boys from multiple angles. We get one shot at this, make it count. The response was immediate and devastating. 7 American tanks positioned by fortune and design at different points around the German advance route opened fire simultaneously on the lead Tiger, concentrating enough firepower to penetrate even its formidable armor and destroy the tank in a spectacular explosion that illuminated the entire battlefield. The remaining German tanks, suddenly exposed and under fire from directions they had not anticipated, found themselves fighting a battle for which their training and equipment had not prepared them. American tank crews, energized by their success and confident in tactics that had already proven effective, pressed their attack with aggressive maneuvers that prevented German crews from establishing the long-range fire superiority that Tiger tanks required to be effective. The psychological impact of destroying a Tiger tank, long considered invulnerable by both sides, rippled through both forces. American morale soared as crews realized they could defeat Germany's best equipment through superior tactics and coordination, while German confidence wavered as supposedly invincible weapons proved vulnerable to concentrated American attack. The final phase of the engagement demonstrated how individual tactical innovation could cascade into strategic success as Ravencroft's maneuver inspired similar adaptations throughout American forces in the region. Word of the successful defense spread through radio networks to adjacent units, providing tactical intelligence and inspiration to American forces that were facing similar German attacks throughout the Ardennes sector. tank commanders, who had been trained to fight according to established doctrine, began to experiment with reverse maneuvers, flanking attacks, and coordinated fire that transformed individual Sherman tanks into components of larger tactical systems capable of defeating superior German equipment through superior coordination and adaptation. The German forces, having lost the element of surprise and tactical initiative, found themselves engaged in exactly the kind of fluid combat that favored American advantages in training, mechanical reliability, and individual initiative. Major von Seckendorf, recognizing that his force had lost tactical coherence and was taking unsustainable casualties, ordered a withdrawal that became a rout as German tanks, no longer protected by prepared positions and coordinated fire plans, became vulnerable to pursuing American forces that pressed their attack with confidence born of success. The mathematics of the engagement had been completely reversed. What began as 36 German tanks attacking 17 American tanks ended with 12 surviving German tanks retreating from 15 operational American tanks that had proven capable of tactical adaptation exceeding anything German planning had anticipated. Ravencroft's Charlie 7, its armor scarred by German fire but its crew intact and victorious, led the pursuit until ammunition shortages and fuel limitations forced a halt that probably prevented an even more complete German disaster. The immediate tactical success was significant, but the strategic implications would prove even more important as American forces throughout the region began to adopt similar tactics that transformed defensive engagements into offensive opportunities. Tank crews that had been trained to fight according to manual doctrine discovered that combat effectiveness depended more on adaptation and innovation than on adherence to established procedures, a lesson that would prove decisive in subsequent engagements throughout the Battle of the Bulge and beyond. The engagement near Bullingen became a case study in tactical innovation that was transmitted through after-action reports and informal communication networks to American armored units throughout Europe, contributing to the development of combined arms tactics that would prove decisive in the final campaigns of the war. The immediate aftermath of the engagement found Ravencroft and his crew exhausted, low on ammunition, and uncertain whether their tactical success would be viewed as heroic innovation or dangerous insubordination by higher command. The radio silence that had preceded the battle had been caused by German jamming equipment, but the decision to break formation and engage without orders remained a clear violation of military protocol that could result in court-martial proceedings if commanding officers chose to emphasize discipline over results. Ravencroft's after-action report, filed 3 days later when communication with higher headquarters was restored, detailed the tactical situation and his reasoning in language that emphasized immediate threats to American lives rather than philosophical disagreements with official doctrine. His crew, questioned separately by investigating officers, provided testimony that supported Ravencroft's account and emphasized the effectiveness of his tactical decisions in preventing what would certainly have been a catastrophic defeat for American forces. The investigation that followed revealed the extent to which German intelligence had penetrated American communication networks and tactical planning, validating Ravencroft's instinctive recognition that standard procedures had been compromised and that survival required adaptation beyond established doctrine. Official commendation came slowly and quietly, reflecting military hierarchy's discomfort with subordinates who achieved success through disobedience, even when that disobedience proved tactically sound and strategically beneficial. Ravencroft received the Silver Star for his actions, but the citation carefully emphasized his response to immediate tactical threats rather than acknowledging that he had deliberately chosen to disobey direct orders. His crew received Bronze Stars and commendations that recognized their skill and courage, without mentioning the unconventional nature of their tactical approach. The engagement was classified at a level that prevented detailed discussion in contemporary military publications, but tactical lessons derived from American success were disseminated through training programs that taught armored commanders to maintain tactical flexibility and individual initiative within the framework of military discipline. Ravencroft himself was quietly promoted and transferred to a training command, where his experience could be used to prepare other tank commanders for combat that might require similar tactical adaptation and individual decision-making under extreme pressure. The personal cost of Ravencroft's decision became apparent in the months following the engagement, as he struggled with the psychological burden of command decisions made under extreme pressure and the knowledge that his actions had saved American lives while ending German ones. Letters from crew members and tank commanders who had survived because of his tactical innovation provided some consolation, but the weight of leadership in life-and-death situations proved difficult to bear, even when decisions proved correct and beneficial. His post-war life reflected the quiet heroism that characterized many American veterans. He returned to Montana, married his childhood sweetheart, and operated the auto repair shop he had dreamed of before the war intervened to transform him into a tank commander whose tactical innovation had influenced armored doctrine throughout the American military. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, deflecting attempts by local newspapers and veteran organizations to publicize his decorations and combat achievements. When pressed by family members or close friends about his experiences, he would emphasize the collective effort of tank crews and the importance of training and preparation, while minimizing his own role in tactical decisions that had proven decisive. His wife, Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, noted in letters to her sister that her husband sometimes woke from nightmares involving tank combat, but that he seemed more troubled by the responsibility for other men's lives than by fear for his own safety. The auto repair shop prospered, serving a community that knew Ravencroft as a reliable mechanic and honest businessman, rather than as a decorated combat veteran whose tactical innovation had influenced military doctrine and saved dozens of American lives. His mechanical skills, honed through years of maintaining and operating complex military equipment under extreme conditions, proved valuable in civilian life, where customers appreciated his ability to diagnose and repair problems that challenged other mechanics. He served on the local school board and volunteer fire department, continuing the pattern of quiet service that had characterized his military career, and reflecting values that emphasized community responsibility and collective welfare over individual recognition or advancement. The strategic implications of Ravencroft's tactical innovation extended far beyond the immediate engagement, as American armored forces throughout Europe began to incorporate similar flexibility and adaptation into standard operating procedures that had previously emphasized rigid adherence to established doctrine. After-action reports from the Ardennes engagement were studied by tactical analysts who recognized that combat effectiveness often depended more on individual initiative and adaptation than on conformity to predetermined procedures, leading to training modifications that emphasized tactical flexibility within the framework of military discipline. Tank commander training programs began to include scenarios that required subordinate officers to make independent decisions when communication with higher command was lost or when battlefield conditions differed significantly from intelligence estimates and planning assumptions. The reverse maneuver that Ravencroft had executed became part of advanced tactical training, though instructors emphasized that such techniques should be employed only under specific circumstances and with careful consideration of tactical alternatives that might achieve similar results with less risk. Military historians analyzing the Battle of the Bulge identified individual tactical innovations like Ravencroft's as critical factors in American success, demonstrating how battlefield adaptation and individual initiative could overcome superior enemy equipment and numerical advantage when properly executed and supported. The engagement near Bullingen was cited in post-war studies as an example of how American military effectiveness depended not solely on material superiority, but on training systems that produced individual soldiers capable of tactical innovation and adaptation under extreme pressure. European allies studying American tactical methods noted the emphasis on individual initiative and flexibility that distinguished American armored doctrine from European approaches that emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. The lessons learned from engagements like the one Ravencroft had dominated influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period, contributing to training programs that emphasized adaptability and individual initiative as essential components of military effectiveness in uncertain and rapidly changing tactical situations. Tank crews serving in Korea and Vietnam received training that incorporated tactical flexibility derived from World War II experiences, demonstrating how individual innovation in one engagement could influence military doctrine for decades and across multiple conflicts. The broader historical significance of Ravencroft's decision extended beyond military tactics to questions of individual responsibility and moral courage that resonated throughout American culture in the post-war period. His choice to disobey orders in order to save lives reflected values that emphasized results over procedure and individual conscience over institutional authority, themes that would become central to American discussions of military service and civilian leadership throughout the Cold War era. Veterans returning from Europe carried stories of individual initiative and tactical adaptation that influenced American understanding of military effectiveness and the importance of training systems that produced soldiers capable of independent decision-making under extreme pressure. The engagement near Bullingen became part of a larger narrative about American military culture that emphasized innovation, adaptation, and individual responsibility as essential components of national defense capability, influencing recruitment and training programs for decades after the war ended. Ravencroft's story, though not widely publicized during his lifetime, became part of oral tradition within armored forces that emphasized the importance of tactical flexibility and individual initiative in combat situations where established procedures proved inadequate or counterproductive. Military academies studying the engagement identified it as an example of how battlefield success often depended on subordinate officers willing to accept responsibility for decisions that exceeded their official authority, but which tactical situations demanded for mission success and preservation of life. The psychological profile that allowed Ravencroft to recognize tactical opportunities and act decisively, despite institutional pressure to follow established procedures, became a subject of study for military psychologists interested in identifying and developing leadership potential in combat environments. His post-war adjustment and successful civilian career provided evidence that tactical innovation and military leadership skills could be successfully transferred to civilian contexts where similar qualities of analysis, decision-making, and personal responsibility proved valuable in business and community leadership roles. The values that had enabled his wartime success, including careful analysis of complex situations, willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions, and emphasis on collective welfare over individual advancement, characterized his civilian life and contributed to community respect that had nothing to do with his military decorations or combat achievements. Letters and testimonies from crew members and fellow tank commanders provided evidence of the lasting impact that Ravencroft's leadership had on individuals who served under his command and witnessed his tactical innovation during the most intense periods of the war. Corporal Kowalski, the gunner who had executed impossible shots while Charlie 7 maneuvered at high speed through enemy fire, wrote to Ravencroft annually on the anniversary of the Bullingen engagement, expressing gratitude for leadership that had enabled him to survive the war and return to his family in Pennsylvania. Private Toretti, the driver whose mechanical skill had been essential to the success of Ravencroft's maneuver, named his son Cornelius and maintained correspondence with his former commander until Ravencroft's death in 1987. Lieutenant Ashworth, whose tank had been second to follow Ravencroft's innovative tactics, went on to command armored units in Korea, where he applied lessons learned from his former sergeant's example, reporting that tactical flexibility and individual initiative had proven decisive in multiple engagements against North Korean and Chinese forces. The crew of Devil Dog submitted a collective statement to military historians researching the Battle of the Bulge, emphasizing that their survival and subsequent military success had been directly attributable to tactical leadership that emphasized adaptation and innovation over rigid adherence to procedure. Tank commanders throughout the 3rd Armored Division, who had participated in subsequent engagements, reported that techniques derived from Ravencroft's example had proven effective in multiple tactical situations, suggesting that his innovation had contributed to unit effectiveness far beyond the immediate engagement where it was first employed. Sergeant Whitehorse, who had commanded the 3rd Tank in the American formation, wrote in his memoir that watching Ravencroft's tactical adaptation had taught him that military effectiveness depended more on intelligent analysis of immediate tactical problems than on memorization of doctrinal solutions to theoretical situations. Veterans organizations that brought together tank crews who had served in Europe during World War II included annual recognition of the Bullingen engagement as an example of American tactical excellence and individual initiative that had contributed to Allied victory and the preservation of democratic values against totalitarian aggression. The doctrinal changes that resulted from analysis of Ravencroft's tactical innovation reflected broader evolution in American military thinking that emphasized flexibility, adaptation, and individual initiative as essential components of combat effectiveness in uncertain and rapidly changing operational environments. Tank commander training programs developed in the 1950s incorporated scenario-based exercises that required individual decision-making under extreme pressure, using simulated communication failures and tactical surprises that demanded adaptation beyond established procedures. The reverse maneuver that had proven decisive in the Ardennes engagement was taught as an advanced tactical technique, though instructors emphasized that its effectiveness depended on precise timing, crew coordination, and tactical judgment that could not be reduced to simple procedural steps. Military analysts studying the engagement identified crew training and mechanical reliability as factors that had enabled tactical innovation, leading to equipment development and training programs that emphasized individual proficiency and unit cohesion as prerequisites for tactical flexibility. Advanced armored warfare schools began teaching courses on tactical adaptation that used the Bullingen engagement as a case study in battlefield decision-making under extreme pressure, emphasizing how individual initiative could achieve tactical success when properly supported by training, equipment, and unit cohesion. Foreign military observers studying American tactical methods noted the emphasis on individual initiative and adaptation that distinguished American doctrine from approaches that emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to predetermined procedures, contributing to international recognition of American tactical innovation and training effectiveness. The psychological factors that had enabled Ravencroft to recognize tactical opportunities and act decisively became subjects of study for military psychologists developing leadership training programs that emphasized decision-making under pressure and the ability to balance institutional authority with individual responsibility for mission success. NATO tactical doctrine developed during the Cold War incorporated principles derived from American World War II experiences, emphasizing flexible response and individual initiative as essential components of alliance military effectiveness against potential Soviet aggression in European theaters. The human cost of innovation became apparent in testimonies from German survivors of the engagement, who provided evidence of how American tactical adaptation had disrupted carefully planned operations and contributed to German tactical failure throughout the Ardennes campaign. Former Major von Seckendorf, interviewed by military historians in 1963, acknowledged that German tactical planning had been based on assumptions about American responses that proved incorrect when individual commanders demonstrated willingness to abandon established procedures in favor of tactical adaptation guided by immediate battlefield conditions. German tank crews who survived the engagement reported that American tactical unpredictability had made it impossible to establish the coordinated fire and movement that German doctrine required for success against numerically inferior but tactically flexible opponents. The psychological impact of American tactical innovation on German morale became apparent in post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans who emphasized that encounters with American forces who refused to follow predicted patterns of behavior contributed to loss of confidence in German tactical superiority and military leadership. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that German tactical planning had been based on detailed study of American training manuals and doctrine, but that this planning had not anticipated the degree to which individual American commanders would be willing and able to adapt established procedures to meet tactical requirements that exceeded doctrinal assumptions. Former German tank commanders noted that American mechanical reliability and crew training had enabled tactical maneuvers that German equipment and training methods could not duplicate, contributing to tactical advantages that offset German superiority in armor protection and firepower. The broader strategic implications of tactical adaptations like Ravencroft's became apparent in German post-war analysis that identified American flexibility and innovation as decisive factors in Allied victory, demonstrating how individual initiative and tactical adaptation could achieve strategic results exceeding their immediate tactical impact. Wehrmacht tactical analysts concluded that American military culture's emphasis on individual responsibility and adaptation had produced combat effectiveness that German centralized command systems could not match, contributing to military failure that reflected broader political and social weaknesses in totalitarian systems that discouraged individual initiative and innovative thinking. The ironic reversal of expectations that characterized the engagement reflected broader themes about courage, authority, and individual responsibility that resonated throughout American culture during the post-war period and the subsequent decades of Cold War confrontation with totalitarian systems. Ravencroft's decision to disobey orders in order to save lives demonstrated how individual conscience and tactical judgment could prove more valuable than institutional authority and established procedure, challenging assumptions about military discipline and the relationship between individual responsibility and collective effectiveness. His story became part of a larger narrative about American values that emphasized innovation, adaptation, and individual initiative as essential characteristics of democratic society and military effectiveness against threats from authoritarian systems that discouraged independent thinking and tactical flexibility. The engagement near Bullingen illustrated how democratic military systems that encouraged individual initiative and tactical adaptation could achieve effectiveness exceeding that of authoritarian systems that emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to predetermined procedures, providing evidence that political and military freedom contributed to tactical and strategic success. Military historians analyzing the broader implications of World War II noted that individual innovations like Ravencroft's reflected training systems and military culture that produced soldiers capable of independent decision-making and tactical adaptation, characteristics that would prove essential in subsequent confrontations with totalitarian systems during the Cold War era. The psychological profile that enabled tactical innovation under extreme pressure became a subject of study for educators and psychologists interested in developing leadership potential in civilian contexts, where similar qualities of analysis, decision-making, and personal responsibility proved valuable in business, education, and community leadership roles. American military culture's emphasis on individual initiative and tactical flexibility influenced international perceptions of democratic military effectiveness and contributed to alliance relationships based on shared values of individual responsibility and collective defense against authoritarian threats. The values that had enabled Ravencroft's tactical success, including careful analysis of complex situations, willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions, and emphasis on collective welfare over individual advancement, became recognized as essential components of democratic leadership in both military and civilian contexts. The legacy of Cornelius Ravencroft's 14 seconds of tactical brilliance extended far beyond the immediate preservation of 17 tank crews to influence military doctrine, training methods, and cultural understanding of individual responsibility that shaped American military effectiveness throughout the remainder of the 20th century. His decision to break formation and charge backward into history demonstrated that the most devastating weapon against overwhelming odds was not superior equipment or numerical advantage, but individual courage guided by tactical intelligence and moral commitment to the preservation of life. The reverse maneuver that saved his company became a symbol of American military culture that valued innovation, adaptation, and individual initiative as essential components of combat effectiveness in uncertain and rapidly changing operational environments. Tank commanders serving in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts received training that incorporated tactical flexibility derived from Ravencroft's example, demonstrating how individual innovation in one engagement could influence military doctrine across multiple wars and different operational theaters. His story illustrated fundamental questions about the relationship between authority and responsibility, obedience and conscience, that continued to resonate in American military culture and civilian society throughout the Cold War period and beyond. The engagement near Bullingen proved that sometimes the most important battles were won not by following orders, but by having the courage to break them, when human lives hung in the balance and tactical intelligence demanded innovation beyond established procedure. Military academies studying his tactical decision identified it as an example of leadership under extreme pressure that emphasized results over procedure and collective welfare over institutional conformity. The broader implications of his choice extended beyond military tactics to questions of individual responsibility and moral courage that influenced American understanding of democratic leadership and the importance of training systems that produced citizens capable of independent decision-making under pressure. His post-war life as a quiet mechanic and community leader demonstrated how wartime leadership skills could be successfully transferred to civilian contexts where similar qualities of analysis, decision-making, and personal responsibility contributed to community welfare and democratic governance. The values that had enabled his tactical success continued to characterize his civilian life, reflecting consistency between wartime service and peacetime citizenship that illustrated the relationship between military effectiveness and democratic culture. Today, more than 80 years after that December morning in the Ardennes forest, Ravencroft's story serves as a reminder that heroism often requires the courage to break rules when following them would result in preventable tragedy. His reverse maneuver into history demonstrated that the most important victories are sometimes achieved not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by individual courage guided by tactical intelligence and moral commitment to the preservation of life. The 14 seconds that transformed a German ambush into American victory illustrate how individual decision-making under extreme pressure can achieve results that exceed the sum of training, equipment, and institutional support. Military historians studying his tactical innovation note that combat effectiveness often depends more on individual initiative and adaptation than on rigid adherence to established procedures, lessons that remain relevant in contemporary operational environments where tactical situations change rapidly and communication with higher command may be limited or compromised. His story challenges us to consider our own capacity for moral courage and tactical adaptation when faced with situations where following established procedures might result in preventable harm to others and where individual responsibility demands action beyond institutional authority. The engagement near Bullingen reminds us that democratic military effectiveness depends not solely on material superiority, but on training systems and cultural values that produce individuals capable of independent decision-making and tactical innovation under extreme pressure. Educational institutions studying leadership development note that the psychological factors that enabled Ravencroft's tactical success, including careful analysis of complex situations, willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions, and emphasis on collective welfare over individual advancement, remain relevant in civilian contexts where similar challenges demand similar responses. His legacy invites reflection on the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority, challenging us to develop the moral courage and tactical intelligence necessary to make correct decisions when following orders might result in preventable tragedy. The question his story poses remains as relevant today as it was that December morning in 1944. When faced with a choice between following orders and saving lives, would you have the courage to break formation and charge backward into history, or would you follow procedure and watch preventable tragedy unfold before your eyes? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means, and how one tank driver's willingness to break every rule saved 17 crews and changed battlefield history forever.